Good morning. We ran out of outlines. I did 35. Apparently it's not enough. And he's having problems. Mark is having a problem. Would you go help him, Gary? He's smarter than the average bear, though, I think. So maybe he'll figure it out. Those of you that do have the outlines that I've given you, one of the reasons I did Roper's outline is because what he did is, in the outline, if you've got one, you'll see that on the first page there of your outline, he gave us a map. And the other reason is that through the outline that he does, he asks some questions for you to study. So it's a bigger outline than what Gary does or what Derek did or Chris probably did, but it kind of gives you some questions that you can ask yourself and do maybe some further study on there. So we're still in trying to get Jesus out of the Herod's territory. And so I'm going to start off by reading Matthew 15, verses 21 through 28. And if you want to, if you're using your Bible, if you want to, I would get a member's card from the pew in front of you, and I put it in chapter 7 of Mark, because we're going to be going back and forth. So that's just a suggestion. So just to kind of let you know. So follow along with me as we begin our study this morning. Then Jesus went out from there and departed to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And behold, a woman of Canaan came from that region and cried out to him, saying, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely demon-possessed." But he answered her not a word. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she cries out after us." But he answered and said, "I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Then she came and worshipped him, saying, "Lord, help me." But he answered and said, "It is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs." And she said, "Yes, Lord. Yet even the little dogs eat the crumbs which fall from the master's table." Then Jesus answered and said to her, "O woman, great is your faith. Let it be to you as you desire." And then Matthew records, and her daughter was healed that very hour. So it looks like here that Jesus has chosen to continue his withdrawal and skipping about, moving from place to place, trying to get away from his adversaries who would want to kill him. So Tyre and Sidon were coastal cities. If you'll look back to your map there, Tyre and Sidon are the coastal cities in the ancient lands of Phoenicia, and they played a very important part of ancient history of the Jewish people. Phoenicia was a narrow strip on the northeastern corner of the Mediterranean Sea, and this would make it kind of northwest of Galilee. In the day of Christ, it was part of the Roman province of Syria. So, when Jesus arrived in the region of Tyre, he entered a house trying to keep it secret, but according to Mark 7 and verse 24, records that he could not be hidden. So it's not long before the Lord was interrupted by someone wanting help. So let's turn over to, as I was saying, to Mark 7 and verses 24. Mark 7 and verse 25, 25 and 26. For a woman whose young daughter had an unclean spirit about her heard him, and she came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she kept asking him to cast out the demon out of her daughter. Now, the reason I go over here and read Mark is because Matthew left out the fact that she was a Syrophoenician woman. So going back and forth, make sure you covered and get all the information that you need to understand what's going on. Well, the term Greek here is often used in the New Testament to refer to Gentiles in general. So the term Syrophoenician distinguished the Phoenicians from other citizens of the Syrian province. Matthew 15, verse 22 records, "And behold, a woman of Canaan came from that region and cried out to him, saying, Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely demon." Well, this son of David that's used here, this phrase, was actually an Israelite messianic term. And it appears that the Jewish hope had made its way to the nations around him, and that was a good thing. So Mark 7 and verse 26 records that she kept asking him to cast out the demon. Now, this was a very persistent, noisy mother. Her child needed help, and she wanted everybody to know about it. The interchange that began between Jesus and the woman was one of the most dramatic and strange, I would say strange, conversations that took place. On the surface, it appears that Jesus insulted her deliberately, and you wouldn't think that he would do that. Initially, he ignored her, and his disciples tried to get rid of her. And so says Matthew 15 and verse 23. And they wanted her just to get away from her. So remember what happened over in Matthew 14 and verse 15 in the feeding of the 5,000. Matthew records, when it was evening, his disciples came to him saying, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is already late. Send the multitudes away that they may go into the villages and buy themselves food." And you would think by now the apostles would kind of be a little bit more helpful in doing some of the things they do, but apparently they probably need an attitude adjustment every now and then. So it could have been that they might have just been suggesting that Jesus really just give her what he wants and then send her on her way, and then she would leave them alone. And so when he finally spoke to her, he said, "I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Well, that's interesting. This woman was desperate, and she was not going anywhere. Matthew 15 and verse 25 says that she came and worshiped him, saying, "Lord, help me." And Jesus responds in verse 27 of Mark, "Let the children be filled first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs." Now, the children that's used here in this sentence are obviously the Jews, and they would, which would make the Gentiles the dogs. So the word first indicates that later the Gentiles would have their opportunity. And instead of becoming angry, the mother answered in verse 28, which is very interesting. And she answered and said to him, "Yes, Lord, yet even the little dogs under the table eat from the children's crumbs." You just think about what he said and then what she said. Now, where's she coming from? This is apparently, I think, a very intelligent woman. I don't know what kind of reaction Jesus had, but apparently he saw in her face a mother's great love for her daughter. So Matthew records right after that she was healed at once. Mark records that when she got back home, she found the child lying on the bed, probably exhausted from the traumatic experience when the demon had left her. So when Jesus and his disciples had finally left the region of Tyre, they did not immediately return to Galilee. Instead of trying to avoid Herod's territory, they moved north to Sidon and then east across the mountains in the headwaters of the Jordan River. If you look on your map, you'll kind of see where we're talking about. And then south along the eastern coast of the Sea of Galilee until they reached a desolate spot in the region of Decapolis. Mark 7 and verse 31 says, "And again, departing from the region of Tyre and Sidon, he came through the midst of the region of Decapolis to the Sea of Galilee." So when the Lord reached his destination, he climbed the side of the mountain and sat down and probably to teach his disciples, Matthew 15 and 29. So once more he was interrupted in Matthew 15 and verse 30. So the original text here says that they cast down those who were sick. Well, the New King James Version actually says they laid them down, which just seems, I can't imagine them casting down and pushing people down and moving them out of the way and to when they needed help. So it does indicate that there was some urgency of some kind. So if Christ became frustrated at these continual interruptions, he didn't really show it. Here he turned the interruption to an opportunity to point the hearts of mainly the Gentile audience to the true and living God. The crowd had different makeup than the previous crowd in the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. The crowd had followed Jesus from Capernaum, if you'll remember, and would have been mainly Jewish. This crowd had come from the region, and they would primarily be Gentile. Matthew 15 and verse 31. So the multitude marveled when they saw the mute speaking, the maimed made whole, and the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they glorified the God of the rest. So Mark records one specific incident, the healing of one who was deaf and spoke with difficulty. This is over in Mark 7, verses 32 and 34. So let's read that quickly. Then they brought to him those who were deaf, the one that was deaf, and had an impediment of speech, and they begged him to put his hand on him. And he took him aside from the multitude, and put his fingers in his ear, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to himself, and I can't pronounce that word, so I'm just going to say, that is, be opened. Apparently, the man's difficulty in speaking was not merely the result of unable to hear. He had an impediment of speech. So the Greek text literally means spitting when he said he touched his tongue. It may gross you out when we talk about that, but that was just the way that Jesus did it. The original text does not indicate where Christ spit, nor does it say, if anything, what he did with the saliva or spit. And so why did Jesus put his fingers in the man's ear? I don't know. It doesn't say. Why did he spit? I don't know. We're not told. So then he looked in verse 34, he says, looking up to heaven, he sighed. So I think this lets us know that the Lord did not heal mechanically and without feeling. His heart was touched by every person who struggled with physical or spiritual issues. McGarvey said that Christ may have sighed because he thought of the millions that were deaf and unable to speak, who in this world would never speak or hear again. Then he said, be opened. And the man's ears were open, and the impediment of the tongue was loosed, and he spoke plainly. And verse 37 records, they were astonished beyond measure, saying, he has done things well. So when Jesus eventually left that area, he left people whose hearts were ready to receive the gospel. The seed had been planted. And when the church was scattered from Jerusalem in Acts 8 and verses 1 through 4, if you want to turn over there with me, and I will read Acts 8, verses 1 through 4. I'm going to read verse 1 and 4. Now, when Saul was consenting to his death, at that time, a great persecution arose against the church, and this is right after Stephen had been killed, okay? Against the church, which was at Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. And then verse 4 says, therefore those who were scattered went everywhere preaching the word. Well, one of those that was preaching the word was Philip, if you will remember. He went down to the city of Samaria and preached to Christ, city of Samaria and preached to Christ. And then the multitudes were in one accord and heeding the things that Philip was hearing and seeing the miracles that he did. So this kind of puts us to also Luke records, now those who were scattered after the persecution that arose over Stephen traveled as far as Phoenicia and other cities. This is over in chapter 11 and verse 19. So we're making the connections here. So the hearts of many of those were receptive because of the early work done by John the Baptizer and Jesus and the apostles. So the lesson to be learned here is if we were acting the right way to interruptions, we will be showing the Spirit of the Lord, and this may open the door to teaching the gospel to those who interrupted us. Patience is a virtue. Went on a visit yesterday carrying one of these baskets back here that they're still sitting, a bunch of them sitting back here that need to be delivered. I had a conversation with a young man yesterday. He was out working on his car. I interrupted him, but he took the time to listen to what I had to say, and we had a nice little conversation. I invited him to church. He may show up. His name's Calvin, by the way. If he introduces himself as Calvin, welcome him here this morning. But he was appreciative of what was in that basket. Now, Matthew 15, verses 32 through 39. Earlier, Jesus had instructed a healed man in that area to tell everyone what had happened to him. Mark 5 and verse 19. However, Jesus did not permit him, but said to him, go home to your friends and tell them what things the Lord has done for you, and now he has had compassion on you. Mark 7 and verse 36. He gave him orders not to tell anybody. because the purpose had changed. So now he needed some time with his apostles. So his request to be alone with his apostles was not heeded, and his fame spread throughout the region. His numbers grew until there was a very large crowd, it says in Mark 8 and verse 1. Matthew records in chapter 15 and verse 38 about 4,000 men besides women and children. Matthew tells us about how many, and Mark just says a multitude. So he just didn't get as specific as Matthew had gotten as far as the numbers were concerned. There could have been 8,000 to 12,000 present, some of whom had come from a greater distance, according to Mark 8 and verse 3. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, for some of them have come from afar. And that kind of sets the stage. Now, Chris last week went over I guess who did the 5,000? Gary did. This is a loaf of bread that they're talking about. This is a pita bread, by the way. This is a can of sardines. And so the fish that they were eating compares to this. Loaf of bread, one fish about this size. Back years ago, I went fishing with a buddy of mine, and we took some sardines and crackers and some hoop cheese with us and Coke. I would pass this around, but if it was opened by anybody in here, you would certainly know that a can of sardines had been opened. It has a smidge. Of course, back in the day, the way that they kept their fish, they packed it in salt. That was the preservative back in that day. But my buddy and I, he had to prove a point. He said that if you're not a man if you can't eat sardines and drink a Coke and have this. So I finally got it down. Best I can remember, that's the only time I've eaten sardines. So y'all may love them. And if you do, good for you. If you want that can, you can take it home with you. But because it's not going to be open in my house. So I may feed it to my cats. And they may turn the cats, their heads against it. But anyway. So once again, Jesus was interrupted and continued there for 3 days, that interruption. So it's not given the details of what he was talking about, but I'm assure you that he was teaching and healing and trying to get to bring his message to those who were there. See, unlike those who had earlier followed Jesus from Capernaum, this crowd would have come prepared with provisions. But after 3 days, they had run out of supplies. At that point, the interruption changed. They desperately needed food. In keeping with who he was, he again turned an interruption to a beneficial break. He presented the problem to his disciples, and they said, in effect, we have no idea how to handle this situation. That's my words. So, if you will, turn over to the last page in your outline, and what I've done there is Roper has given some comparisons to the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000, which is very interesting. And so we're going to go through that real quickly, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to include this in your outline, because you may have had people say, "Well, that was the same event," but it's. I think he makes the case that it's really not. So Matthew and Mark recorded both events, and they were not writing down stories passed down over decades. If you remember, Matthew wrote an eyewitness since he was an apostle. Mark's account was based on eyewitness testimony that of Peter, one of the apostles. Remember, Mark and Peter had a relationship, so they probably had this conversation. And then Mark wrote it down. Jesus later referred to both events during an admonition to his disciples later in Matthew 16 and later on in Mark 8. Although there are similarities between the two events, there are also differences. The place was different. The location of the first miraculous feeding was near the northern end of the Sea of Galilee, and the second was near the southern end. The crowd was different. The first was largely Jewish, the second largely Gentile. The size of the crowd was different, of course, 4,000, 5,000. The time involved was different. The first crowd had been there for 1 day. The second crowd had been there for 3 days. The reason for the need for food was different. The first crowd had not brought food, and the second crowd had run out of food. The available resources were different. 5 loaves and 2 fishes were available for the first time, and 7 loaves and 2 fishes were involved the second time. The tools were different. 12 small baskets were used in the first incident. 7 large baskets were used in the second. A different Greek word for basket is used in the second feeding. The word for basket in the feeding of the 4,000 means a large basket. These baskets were sometimes large enough to hold a man. So it was a pretty big basket, that you would think. There are some things to be noted. The first sat on the grass, Matthew 14 and 19 says. The second crowd sat on the ground, Matthew 15 and verse 35. The first crowd tried to make him king, and there was no similar response from the second crowd. So in our studies, we found that it took a lot more time for the disciples to really grasp a new truth. J.W. McGarvey wrote that the failure to expect a miracle despite the previous experience was a common occurrence in the history of Israel and the 12 apostles. Flip with me over to, or your phones are over there. I'm going to read from Psalms 78 verses 19 and 20. I thought this was interesting. It kind of shows you what was going on in the day. I should have marked this. It wouldn't take much time to do this. 78. Verses 17 through 20. Psalm 78. But they sinned even more against him by rebelling the Most High in the wilderness, and they tested God in their heart by asking for the food for their fancy. Yes, they spoke against God. They said, "Can God prepare a table in the wilderness? Behold, he struck the rock, and so the waters gushed out and the streams overflowed. Can he give bread also? Can he provide meat for his people?" And this is just kind of the doubting that the people back in that day and the doubting of the people in this day, in this particular time, kind of had toward miracles and what people did. So we need to remember that the disciples in Christ were often hungry and would receive out food and water, according to John 4, verses 6, 8, and 30. Remember the Samaritan woman at the Jacob's well? The apostles went into Sychar to find food, and then when they got back, they found Jesus talking to this woman. So once again, Jesus miraculously fed that crowd. So keep in mind that he did not do this merely to alleviate hunger, but also to teach the 12 apostles a needed lesson. So let's go back to Matthew 15, verse 39. And he sent away the multitude, got into the boat, and came to the region of Magdala. I guess that's the way you pronounce that. So Jesus did not give up on wanting to be alone with his disciples. Having fed the people, he sent them away and traveled by the boat across to the other side of the sea. So we have Jesus in a series of withdrawals from Galilee to the east side of the Sea of Galilee, and also to the region of Tyre and Sidon, which is in Phoenicia. We'll again see Christ retreating from Galilee, this time to the north, to the mountainous region of Caesarea Philippi. Each withdrawal had its high point. For example, during one of them, the Lord fed 5,000 and then walked on water. And we'll see the withdrawal has some also remarkable events in the space of a week. So these important events occurred. The good confession, the unveiling of Christ's plan to build his church, the first clear announcements concerning Jesus' death, the resurrection, and the second coming, the transfiguration. Most commentators agree that this was an extraordinary time and a turning point in his ministry. So this must have been an extreme emotional time. Let's flip over to Mark 8, verses 11 and 12. This is some of the feelings that Jesus had. Then the Pharisees came out and began to dispute with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven, testing him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Surely I say to you, no sign shall be given to this generation." As one who was fully a man, Christ was made like us in all things. Hebrews 2 and verse 17 says, "Therefore in all things he had to be made like his brethren, that he might be merciful and faithful high priest in the things pertaining to God, to make a propitiation for the sins of the people. So, Matthew 15 and verse 39 through chapter 16 through 12, we find there's going to be another attack by Jesus' enemies, followed by another withdrawal. See, the last time we saw Jesus and his disciples was on the east side of the Sea of Galilee. They got into a boat and crossed over to the west side of the sea, to the region of Magdala and Magdala. And this may have been near the village of Magdala, which is about 4 miles from Tiberias. Now, on your map there, Tiberias is on the map, but this little small town is not there. So when he arrived, his old adversaries, the Pharisees, showed up and began to argue with him. And this is in Mark 8 and verse 11. So, strangely, they were accompanied by the Sadducees. Normally, the Pharisees and Sadducees were enemies, but since both regarded Jesus as a threat, they made an alliance, I guess, to destroy him. So now the Pharisees repeated a challenge they had issued before. They had asked for a sign from heaven to test him, Mark 8 and verse 11. Since he had done hundreds of miracles, including raising the dead, it would be hard to say exactly what they wanted. Matthew 16, verses 2 and 3. Listen to what we'll begin in verse 1. Then the Pharisees and Sadducees came and tested him, asking what he would show them a sign from heaven. And he answered and said to them, when it is evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning it will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and threatening. Hypocrites, you know how to discern the face of the sky, but you cannot discern the signs of the times. The Greek word from heaven means out of heaven. This could mean out of the sky or instead from God. The Greek word for heaven is used in Matthew 16 here as sky to mean sky. Maybe the Pharisees wanted to stop the sun and the moon, as Joshua did over in Joshua the 10th chapter. Well, Joshua knew it, but he asked God to, and that happened. Or to call fire from the skies, as Elijah had done in 1 Kings 18, verse 37 and 38. According to Mark, the confrontation of the Pharisees and the Sadducees caused Christ to sigh deeply in his spirit. He knew that no miracle would satisfy them. You see, their eyes were closed and their hearts were hardened, and there was no way that they'd be convinced. And Jesus gave them a short answer. He said that they were able to look at the sky and predict what the weather would be. You know, there's an old saying, a red sky at night and shepherd's delight, and a red sky in the morning is a shepherd's warning. Because the prejudice of their hearts, they were incapable of seeing Jesus and his ministry and understanding who he was. In Matthew 16 and verse 3, the phrase, the signs of the times, refers to the signs or miracles that Jesus was performing that proved that the times had come for which the Jews had been looking for centuries. The arrival of the Messiah in his kingdom. Now, this does not refer to the signs of Christ's second coming, as some suggest. So then Jesus said in Matthew 16 and verse 4, this was a hidden reference. Let's read that, Matthew 16 and verse 4. A wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign shall be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. So, the hidden reference here is the ultimate proof of his deity, his resurrection. Remember what Paul said over in chapter 1 of Romans in verse 4. And declare to be the Son of God with power according to the Spirit of holiness by the resurrection from the dead. So as Jonah was 3 days in the great fish, so Christ would be 3 days in the grave, Matthew 12 and verse 40. Now it seems that if Jesus planned to spend time in Galilee, the arrival of his enemies made it impossible. So quickly he left there and went away. In the second part of that, is Matthew 16 and verse 4, and he left and then departed. So he got into a ship with the disciples and headed once more for the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee, Mark 8 and verse 13, and this time to the general vicinity of Bethsaida. And so during this trip, Christ gave his disciples a warning, Matthew 16 and verse 6. Then Jesus said to them, "Take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees." And then in verse 6, he later on in Mark 8 and verse 15, he's first, and he says, "Watch out and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees." That's in Matthew 16 verse 6. But Mark 8 and verse 15 says, "Beware of the leaven of Herod," probably referring to the Herodians who were already working with the Pharisees to destroy Jesus. So the figure leaven is often used in the Scripture to refer to influence, especially negative. So Jesus probably had in mind biased ideas taught by these groups that kept them from accepting him as the Messiah. Even the disciples struggled with their own perceived ideas about the Messiah and his kingdom. It might be put this way: beware of being influenced by preconceived ideas that can prevent you from seeing the truth. And I think that's the message here. See, the apostles had no idea what Christ was talking about. The idea of leaven made them think of bread. Jesus' departure had been so fast that they had only brought one loaf of bread with them, Mark 8 and verse 14. So they decided that their master's words were a reprimand for not making proper provisions for the trip. So Jesus was really upset by their lack of understanding, called them men of little faith. They were near the spot where he had recently fed 5,000 men, and not far from the place where he had fed 4,000. If he had fed thousands with very little supplies, they should have understood that he'd have no problem feeding this small group with one loaf, not knowing that he was not referring to physical bread. See, the apostles finally understood, according to Matthew 16 and verse 12. Then they understood that he did not tell them to beware of leaven, of bread, but of the doctrine of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So, let's go over to Mark 8 verse 22 and 26. Then he came to Bethsaida and brought there a blind man to him and begged to touch him. So he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of town. And when he had spit on his eyes and put his hands on him, he asked him if he saw anything. And he looked up and said, "I see men like trees walking." Then he put his hands on his eyes again and made him look up, and he was restored, and everything was clear. Then he sent him to his house, saying, "Neither go into the town nor tell anyone in the town." Christ had wanted to distance himself from his enemies, but he also wanted to spend time with his apostles. So spending time with his disciples would become very important because of his impending death. So he decided to head north to the area of Caesarea Philippi, where hopefully there would be don't you love this pollen? My truck is sitting outside right now. It's white, but probably now it's green. So they started in the direction and came to Bethsaida. This was Bethsaida Julius, on the northeastern shore of the sea. So when they reached the town, the people brought a blind man to Jesus to be healed. Christ did not refuse his request. He had compassion, but he was determined to avoid a crowd, since a large following would have delayed their trip. He led the man out of the town before healing him, and afterward told him to go straight home and tell no one. Only Mark tells this story, the healing of the blind man, and this is one of the two miracles unique to Mark. The other one is the healing of the deaf man in Mark 7, verses 31 through 37. This case of healing had several unusual features. Jesus had only occasionally touched the ones who he had healed. Just one other time he did use spit in connection with his healing, over in Mark 7 and verse 33. The unusual thing about this instance was that this is the only miracle done in two stages. It's often stated that the miracle was gradual, but that would leave the wrong impression. Probably just a few minutes probably was only the length of time. It has been suggested that since it was sandwiched between the two stories of the disciples struggling with their understanding and faith, It is an object lesson to teach, though that faith does not come at once, but in stages. Don't we know that? You know, our faith sometimes is tried, and the things that we go through, we overcome them. We make it through there. We look back and say, you know, that was bad, but I made it and I survived. Christ used a variety of methods to impress that the power was not in the procedure, but the person. So Caesarea is the most northern and the most northern point for which we've any record that Jesus reached during his personal ministry. They added Philippi, distinguished it from the Caesarea, which is mentioned in Acts as the seat of the Roman government for that region. So Luke tells us that Jesus and the disciples were alone and that Jesus was praying. This is over in Luke 9 and verse 18. I haven't told you to go there yet, but that's where we are now. So Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do men say that the Son of Man is?" This is Matthew 16 and verse 13. And by this question, he begins to lead to the great confession made by his disciples. Here we may notice of the development of the faith of the apostles. You see, the first step was the following the call of Jesus. Remember, he went to the apostles and just said to them, "Follow me." And they left what they were doing and they followed him. That's the first step. The second step was their obedience with the limited commission. Remember when Jesus sent out just the 12, and they called it the limited commission? And this was to only the Jews only. That was the limited commission. See, the third stage of development begins with their confession, their commitment. He wants them convinced that they are with him on this and going to take care of his business after he's gone. So this event serves to do two things. First of all, it serves to strengthen their faith. And then it reinforces their convictions. So they had returned from their limited commission and had gathered some information to what the people generally thought about them. They visited with the people and they spoke to the people. So this is the reason he wants to know what they're saying about him. Son of Man was a usual designation that Jesus used with respect to himself. The question simply meant, who do men say that I, Jesus, am? Matthew 16 and verse 14. So they said, some say John the Baptist, some Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. Matthew 16 and verse 15 said, yeah, but who do you say I am? You see, this question ripped down to the very bottom of their hearts, I think. And they really began to think about what was really going on. And see, it called for a confession of their own conviction. It examined the very bottom of their faith, and it called for a clear and definite expression of their faith. Jesus knew what they believed. He knew the strength and depth of their faith, but for their good, he asked for a confession. It is a question that every one of us ought to ask ourselves on a daily basis. Jesus did not care so much for what other people thought of him, but he wanted an expression from his disciples as to what they believed about him. This question called for a faith and not an opinion. So in verse 16, Simon Peter answered and says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. True to his quick and decisive nature, always ready to speak out whether for himself or for his brethren, he gave this clear, emphatic, and decisive answer. The Christ is Greek for the Messiah. Messiah is a Hebrew word for anointed and means the anointed of God as the Redeemer of the world. The Son of God is put in contrast with the Son of Man. He is not merely the Son of Man, but he is the Son of the living God. Men had not taught the disciples of Jesus the truth. This differed about him as the Son of God. Jesus' disciples had not been swayed by the prejudices and opinions of those who rejected him. God had revealed his knowledge to them, not by an unusual or extraordinary communication, nor by any partial or arbitrary favor to them. but as a result of their faith and obedience. These disciples had not received their evidence from the scribes or religious leaders of the day. The prophets of the Old Testament were moved by the Holy Spirit, and when Jesus fulfilled these prophecies in the presence of his disciples, God was saying unto them that Jesus was the Son. So let's continue to read in verses 18 and 19 and 20. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Then he commanded the disciples that they should tell no one that he was Jesus the Christ. The name Peter here means a stone, John 1:42, and the Greek is in the masculine gender. Peter as a rock should be firm, immovable, and fixed as to the preaching of the gospel in the clearest terms on facts and reasoning which enemies could not successfully deny. Peter's energy and boldness helped mold the first growth of the early disciples in the form of stern, simple, and unyielding characters. In the first wave of persecution against the church, he was the rock on which the rage of the Jews was directed. Acts 4 and Acts 12. His courage defended the flock in the first absence of the chief shepherd. Jesus did not say, nor mean to say, that his church would be built upon a stone, but on a solid ledge of a rock. A stone might be too small for a foundation, but a ledge of rock furnished sufficient foundation for the greatest superstructure. It seems clear from the context that Jesus, by using the term Petra, which is P-E-T-R-A, which means a ledge of a rock, referred to the truth that Peter had just confessed, which was the deity of Jesus Christ. So the truth that Jesus is the Son of the living God is the most fundamental and basic of all truths pertaining to man's redemption. He goes on to say, I will build my church. The future tense is used here, which shows that at this time, Jesus had not established his church. It was only a preparatory stage, and yet it was yet to be established. This is the first use of the word church in the New Testament. Here, my church means the assembly or people who have been called out to the world to the gospel of Christ. And then he goes on to say, the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. The ancient cities were surrounded by walls, and they had gates, and they were guarded by special garrisons. The word gates became synonymous with powers. The gates of Hades means the power of Hades. It designates the place to which all who depart this life, the deceased, will go, and with or without their reference to the moral character. In the New Testament, Hades is the realm of the dead. And then he goes on to say, and I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. In other words, I will give you the terms of conditions of admitting people into the church. We see in Acts chapter 2, Peter exercised the authority to announce the Jewish people on the day of Pentecost the terms of admission into the church. In Acts chapter 10, he announced first the terms of admission to the Gentiles in the church. This is Cornelius the visit with him. So Jesus promised to ratify in heaven just what the apostles preached on the earth. They were not left to their own wisdom, but were guided by the Holy Spirit in announcing the terms of admission into the kingdom of God on earth. The terms of admission into the church were the terms of the forgiveness of sins. And those who complied with these terms were forgiven and constituted a part of his church. And that's all I have. Any comments? Please. So Jesus went to Hades. Jesus went to Hades. He would not get out of Hades until what? when he died. Indeed, he came out. Okay, third day. Yes. Any other comments? Gary started off last Sunday night with Saul chasing David. And I think we have some similarity here of what was going on with Christ. Because those who hate what good is going on, the truth is going on, are going to follow you and hate you. And I think it's a lesson to be learned here. If you don't get anything else out of this lesson here, you remember that when you go out of here in just a few minutes to go home, and you have any interaction with other people that are from this, wherever you live, and they're not Christians, they're going to have preconceived ideas about the church and about Jesus and everything else. And so those people are going to challenge you. So I'm not so sure we'll be chased out, but you'd be surprised by it, just like I was saying earlier about the visit I had yesterday. It was a welcoming because the man was there by himself, and it was a welcome conversation because he's just I don't know what kind of relationship he had with his neighbors and everything, but it was very, very neat. Okay, cut me off, please.